Hi guys, it's Rianka. I decided to do the oral part of my portfolio on my PowerPoint I made for assignment number 5, our research paper. Now the reason I chose this one was because when I was making my original PowerPoint, I didn't have a lot of time and I was very pressed on how much I could really put into the assignment. And so I decided that with this portfolio I had the opportunity to improve on something that I had time for now. So, starting right at the title slide, we see that the comparison of these two slides is, first of all, in the color. Now, I decided to keep the color scheme green, but I decided that the type of colors that were in the themes of the slides needed to be changed. Now, if you look over here to my original one, you see that it's a very plain looking green and it's very drab as but as you get into my new one, you see that it has a little bit more texture in the background, some shapes in the background, but the actual color is a little bit more popping. It's a little bit more busy, I guess you would say, but it's not distracting at all overall in the theme. So it's one of the things I decided to do. The new one looks more bright, it looks clean, a little more sharp, and a little bit more modern, and that's what catches a reader or a viewer's eyes. Now, the second thing I decided to do was to change the fonts. If you look at this font up here, it's Callisto MT, and it looks almost like a Times New Roman type of font, and I decided that we see that in a lot of text in reference to textbooks and just books we read, and people don't often like that font. So I decided that I didn't want to make an extremely crazy looking font for my new PowerPoint, but to keep one that's simple but not the same one that we're used to seeing all the time. So this one over here is still pretty simple, but it's a little bit different than what we see all the time with Times New Roman. And then the last thing I decided to change was looking at the two different titles. My original one's The Indian American Family Complex, and the new one is The Life of One of Me. And then the subtitle of that is a look at the life of an Indian American teenager. Now, the reason why I chose to change the titles up is because, one, I feel like The Indian American Family Complex is an accurate title. However, it's a little bit too serious for a topic that is very much personal to me. And second of all, I feel like the newer title, The Life of One of Me, kind of gives you a little bit more of an idea that it is going to be a little bit more personal for me, the creator and maker of this PowerPoint and presentation. And then the subtitle helps saying, okay, well, here's a little bit more clarification on what I'm actually going to talk about. So it clarifies it and it has a little bit more explanation if somebody didn't actually read, or I'm sorry, didn't listen to my presentation, they still know what my PowerPoint would be about. So going into actual slides now, I decided to keep the topic slide the same. I believed that they didn't really need to be changed because that is what we're going to be addressing in the slide. The wording and everything came out of my paper, and that was fine. So this one doesn't really have a lot of change to it. Now the next one, I decided I would actually break up into two different slides. Now, if you look at the original, there's not really a title, but rather two titles with different subpoints under them. And I decided that this wasn't very visually appealing, and nothing really jumps and pops your eye, especially with the colors being very bland. On this one, there's not even green in this slide. And another larger reason is because if you look at these two ideas, the viewpoints and the areas and ideas are two very separate things. And the viewpoints is what is going to fulfill the assignment topic or the requirements, because that's what this paper was about, to see one topic in three different lights. And that's why I needed to have it as its own individual slide, as you see over here. And then I was able to add a visual with this next one because now there's enough room that would make sense to this specific slide. And also you see that it's not just going to be very bland looking with just a lot of text. That this one you have the parts of the scheme, but now you have a picture, you have a title, and you have your subpoints. So it's a little bit more for your eyes to look at, but still not be distracting. So the second one I changed was the areas and ideas. I decided that ideas wasn't a very accurate description, and so the things that we would discuss in the paper would obviously be the areas of discussion. And so that's why I changed the title of this to be areas of discussion. And I have this same five things, except for this one I changed the wording of assimilation instead of having the adaptation of America, because I didn't want to have a phrase in there like you see right here, but instead just have one word to be a little bit more coherent and smooth with the rest of it. So when we move to the next slide, I kept them the same in both because this is kind of introducing us to our topic of when someone thinks of stereotypical Asian family, what do you see? So I decided to keep that the same, just kind of lighten up the mood, as well as still being accurate to my topic. And then I decided to go into my first subpoint, which would be that of hard work. The first change I made was to add an author to this quote right here and to take out this subpoint right here because it's explained within the quote right here. So you see right here, and I decided to add the and then add the author of this quote at the end in case someone wasn't actually able to hear my PowerPoint presentation, so they could just see it on the slide. Now, the second thing I changed over here was the 7 out of 10. If you look at the original slide, you wouldn't know at all what that was talking about. You just see 7 out of 10, and it's not very clear. It's very vague. And so this one over here, I decided to keep the same number instead of having the percentage as the study actually has in the paper, and say, okay, well, if somebody wasn't listening to my presentation, would they still be able to understand what I was talking about? So I decided that since our context is Asian American families, I wouldn't put Asian American wording in here, but to put what the concept was talking about right here. So the 7 of 10 believe they work harder than other Americans. So now you know what that statistic is referring to. And lastly, on the slide, I changed shaming. The concept of shaming and having the subpoint of who I was talking about, my example I would be explaining, and clarify a little bit for people to see that it actually is a familiar concept and not just some concept I'm going to be throwing at them out of the blue. So they're a little bit more familiar with what I'm going to be addressing. So this is the first subpoint. The second one is success and immigration. Now I changed the wording of assimilation from immigration to keep it as coherent as I could with the word change from earlier. And then I decided that these two subpoints right here, just how they were worded with very short words, that was very, very vague. You see past and you don't know what that's in reference to. And then a high bar, which is explained in this quote. So I decided, okay, well, we can put both of those together and then have the quote under it, which I also shortened so it could, so it wouldn't necessarily clutter up the screen as much, because some of the stuff at the beginning you don't really need to know. Then I kept the second, over here I guess would be the second subpoint the same, and then the types of immigration kept the same. And I decided to clarify the concept of restrictions because you don't really know what that means. Restrictions on what, on who, of what. So I decided that, okay, well, when you think of academics and you think of Asians, you see they go very well together. So I wanted to clarify why I would actually be talking about restrictions at all and see that this is just some of the pain that goes through their minds. The next slide on the original, I actually decided to take out because it didn't really look very professional at all, and it didn't really match, especially with the color of the shirt and the background over here. It just kind of isn't very attractive at all. So I decided to take it out, and I'd be explaining this concept anyway. So moving on from there, I have our third subpoint I'd be talking about, which would be proximity. And I decided to keep the first subpoint under this the same, but the second one, Confucian filial piety, I decided to change because just looking at that concept, you have no clue at all what that is. And so I just added a little bit of text to say that, yeah, it's going to be a familiar concept to you, and just here's a little bit of wording so that you're a little bit more familiar with it. The last thing I did on here was parenting types, and so I just changed up the wording of that to see that, yeah, we're talking about parenting types, but instead of just looking at the different types, we're going to actually be comparing two different ones to see why I would be looking at it at all in general. So then I decided that over here I wanted to bring in one of the examples I'd be talking about in my paper, and just to help you understand a little bit more about what I'd be speaking about. And the picture was the same. I decided to change it where it was just to have a little bit of change on the slides themselves. After that, I have the slide of the American culture. And this one, I didn't change any of the text, but I changed the placement of the image so that it would just be a little bit more It would just be a change to where the pictures normally would be in the rest of my slides. Going into my last subpoint, that of stress, I decided to keep the first one in the same order and same wording for the quote, but I wanted to switch up the last two subpoints because I feel like this term right here, suicide, would be kind of the conclusion of this PowerPoint, and so I put over here and I added rates so you can kind of tell I'm not just talking about suicide in general, but more so I'll be talking about statistics, so it kind of just flows in a nice order. So lastly, we look at the conclusion slide, and I decided instead of just having two different paragraphs, I'd number them so that you know that I'm coming to two conclusions that could, I guess, be combined into one paragraph, but I didn't necessarily want to become in a one paragraph, so to kind of separate those ideas. So overall, I decided that now that I had more time to do a paper, I'd make it look a little bit more professional and take a little bit more time into it, because I know that this presentation, just looking at the visuals, were not very attractive or aesthetically pleasing to almost anybody. So now that I had the time, I was able to change some of that up and make it a little bit brighter for everyone. So that's the oral part of my presentation. Thanks.